Hey, I'm glad you're back. Today, let's look at nervous system part 4. That's going to involve the central nervous system and the brain. I want you to start by looking at this diagram. It's kind of disturbing, but take a minute. You'll see there's something terribly wrong right here. There is a piece of metal going through this person's skull. Do you think you could survive that kind of accident with that part of your brain being destroyed? Because underneath that skull, we know your brain is there. Well, this person, Phineas Gage, actually did survive this accident. He was at work one day and an explosion occurred, and it had enough force to drive this piece of pipe through his brain. Well, then he went into surgery and they removed the pipe and stitched him back up, and he survived. It's sort of a landmark case because at that time the neurologist thought that the brain was a lot more fragile than that. So this helped add to the understanding that the brain is a little more plastic, a little more tough than it originally thought, and that you can survive with parts of your brain even missing. Today, as we look at our essential knowledge statement, it reads, cells communicate with each other through direct contact with other cells or from a distance via chemical signaling. Once again, we visit this very familiar diagram and remind ourselves that in the nervous system, we have reception, then there's sensory input, and then there's also integration, where something is done with all this information that comes in. And so today, we'll really be focusing on this integration piece as we study the brain and its components. And then later on, we'll look at the motor output and how reactions are generated. As we consider the nervous system, basically we have two primary components. There's the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system. I like that both of them are named based on their location because the central nervous system is in the center of our body and it includes the brain as well as our spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system are all of those nerves that are outside the center of the body or on the periphery. And so these are the two primary components of the nervous system. The central system, which includes the brain and the spine, or at least the spinal cord, not the bones of the spine so much as the spinal cord there. All right, so the brain and the spine make up the central system, and then the peripheral is made from all of these incoming as well as outgoing neurons that communicate from the body to the spine or brain, and then from the central back out to the motor component, whatever it might be. If we were to take a human brain and just cut it in half, top to bottom like that, and then look inside it, you'll see that there's gray matter and there's white matter. They're a little bit different anatomically. You'll notice straight away that there's a difference in their color. When they are taken out of the body and preserved, they're actually gray and a little more white, and that's where they got their name. But gray matter is made of neurons that are not myelinated. And so it has a different appearance as opposed to the white matter, which is made of neurons that are surrounded with myelin, and they can conduct a little faster then as a result of that. So those are two primary areas or differences that we'll see straight away in the brain. Another thing that you'll notice is this little sort of turquoise blue looking area called ventricles, and this is the portion of the brain that allows the cerebral spinal fluid to come in and bathe and cushion and protect these areas as well. So let's look a little more at the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid, you'll see it sometimes abbreviated as cerebral spinal fluid. And cerebral spinal fluid has the job of cushioning the brain, helping to protect it. So you'll see this sort of blue line right inside here. That's where the cerebral spinal fluid is. And then there's the cranium on the outside, so that if if your head moved too fast or got shaken, then the brain wouldn't smack directly against the bone. Instead, it's protected by this little layer of liquid, the cerebral spinal fluid. Same thing with the nerve cord that's inside our spinal cord. It's protected by the cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid also brings in nutrients and bathes those cells in that area, and then can take waste away from the cells in that area. So our cerebrospinal fluid becomes very important in protecting and feeding and maintaining our central nervous system. Another component of the central nervous system are a specialized type of cells that are called glia cells. The glia cells are important in that they help, for one thing, they help to establish the blood-brain barrier so that things from the blood system or the circulatory system don't enter into our brain, because this is an extra area of protection then that hopefully would keep any kind of pathogens from crossing, and can also prevent certain chemicals from crossing. So these astrocytes are a kind of glial cell that help make the vessel cells form little junctions in between them. They make tight junctions so that these cells aren't quite as leaky as blood vessel cells in other parts of the body, helping to establish the blood-brain barrier. So glial cells are important in the central nervous system. They help to feed and support, and also help with regulation of neuron activities inside the central nervous system. So let's look at this diagram. It's just another way of considering the same bit of information that we keep looking at, the general flow of information through our nervous system. If we start with whatever our external stimulus would be, then that information has to get to our central nervous system, has to enter in. So here we have a peripheral nervous system component that's sending information to the central nervous system, where processing is going to occur. Then once the information is processed, then we have information leaving the central nervous system, going out into the peripheral again. There will be some sort of efferent neuron that would take the information away from the central nervous system. And that neuron could be part of the motor system, which is going to cause some skeletal muscle action eventually. Or it could be part of our autonomic nervous system, which is not consciously controlled. And then that can result in a variety of responses that might be part of our sympathetic response, our parasympathetic response, or our guttural or enteric division. So those are all involuntarily controlled and are part of our autonomic nervous system. So that's not a new pathway. It's this same pathway, just looking at it a little more in depth. So if you were to, let's say you were to, I don't know, walk in the kitchen after school and you smell something. The stimulus is whatever chemical that's in the air, and it is received by some sort of chemoreceptor, in this case olfactory receptor, and then those nerves are going to go into the central nervous system, which then send a message back out. In this case, it would be part of our autonomic nervous system, which is going to cause glands of our enteric division maybe then to secrete saliva. So your mouth waters whenever you smell something that you anticipate is going to taste really good. So that's just an example of that pathway of information flow involving the central nervous system. The primary component, as we mentioned earlier, is of course the brain. It is made of some very specialized structures. It has wrinkles and folds, and by the way, those are not random. They come in a very predictable pattern, and it's not true that you get more folds when you get smarter. Those folds are anatomical structures. They are not wiggly or fluid or something that is amorphic or that comes and goes. So the specific brain structures are specialized, and they have very particular functions, and that development of those structures occurs as you are an embryo. So let's watch how that embryonic development of the brain occurs.
So we're introducing ourselves into this process about 1 month after fertilization, when the entire embryo is smaller than the size of a dime. And we're going to look in at the nervous system where relatively small numbers of cells have been allocated, and then monitor over the 9 months of human gestation the increase in the number of cells and the change in the shape of the central nervous system. So by 3 months, we have something like 1 million cells. The nervous system is beginning to exceed the size of the dime. You can see that the future forebrain and the cortical region are expanding disproportionately to the rest of the nervous system. By 6 months, we have hundreds of millions of neurons, and the brain is beginning to take now a familiar shape. You can see the beginning of the indentations, the sulci and gyri that Eric described, so that by the time we approach the 8 and 9 months, this is now a familiar picture, and we have tens of billions of nerve cells present. After birth, there's yet further addition of cells to produce the 100 billion or so nerve cells that occupy the human brain. And one remarkable feature is that even in adult life, new neurons are being added. And there is evidence that the rate of new neuronal production depends on the degree of richness of your environment. So every time you come to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute headquarters here, you're going to be producing neurons at a remarkable rate, and you will leave with more neurons than you came in with. And so this process of neuronal generation really drives all aspects of behavior.
As you saw in the video, we start to develop our central nervous system very early on. We get our forebrain development, our midbrain development, and hindbrain development as early embryos, even as 1 month old. Then you can see just at 5 weeks that we're starting to see differentiation of these primary areas of our brain, so that by the time the child is ready to be born, it has a fully developed cerebrum, which is that along with the diencephalon makes up our forebrain, as well as the midbrain right in here, which is our brain stem, or part of our brain stem, and then the hindbrain, which includes the medulla oblongata as well as the pons and the brainstem, are also present in this highly developed central nervous system. If we were to take a rear view, one of the things I wanted to point out was that the left side of your brain can talk to the right side of your brain, and this connection point between them is called the corpus callosum. So from this hind view, looking at somebody from the back of their head, you can see the cerebrum here in yellow. All of this area is the cerebrum. And then below that, you see the cerebellum, which is responsible for motor movements. But right in here, you'll see an area called the corpus callosum, and that allows one side of your brain to talk or communicate with the other side of your brain, so that events of the right hemisphere can be coordinated with events of the left, and that's the corpus callosum. These basal nuclei are part of your brain that's in charge of or responsible for motor coordination. So back to a side view. So if we look at this slide, you'll see all this yellow area, which includes, including the diencephalon, makes up our forebrain. So all that makes up our forebrain, which is considered to be the seat of our intelligence. Then we have the midbrain, which handily is right in the center or middle. And then in addition to that, we have the hindbrain. You may have heard somebody say that a person had gone reptilian or something like that. That's a phrase used when we are basing our responses just on our hindbrain, which is considered sort of primitive. But this is where we get a lot of those sort of survival responses from the medulla oblongata. It controls all of our visceral responses, heartbeat, respiration rate, those kinds of things. And so our brain is compartmentalized, with each compartment having very specific and specialized functions. So if we look at this color-coded diagram, you'll see distinct regions based on these colors. You'll notice right away that one of the larger regions is this frontal lobe, and even the frontal lobe is subdivided into the prefrontal area and the motor cortex area, as well as the Broca's area. Broca's area is important in forming our speech and being able to speak. Our decision making, planning, thinking is part of the prefrontal cortex function. And then our motor cortex helps control the muscles of our body, the skeletal muscles of our body, like our arms and legs and hands, all of those skeletal muscles that are important to our actions. In addition, we can see that the cerebrum has a yellow colored area here, which is the somatosensory cortex. Somatosensory is sense of touch, or the senses of the body. And this whole area, the whole yellow area, is called the parietal lobe, and it's really involved in senses and sensory association and integration. Then back in this pink area, which is called the occipital lobe, this is important to our being able to see and to recognize objects and to know what they are when we see them. As well as the visual cortex is included in this occipital lobe, which also helps us to process visual stimulus and recognize what's going on when something's moving, for example. The cerebellum, remember, that's part of the hind brain, and it is responsible for motor coordination. In this green lobe, or the temporal lobe, we see the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's area helps us to understand language and to recognize what words are when we hear that sound, to know that that's a word and not just a clanging or banging sound. In addition, our temporal lobe is also where our auditory nerves and hearing are integrated. So we have very specialized areas of our brain that allow us to do sophisticated things like being able to speak, to recognize and understand language when we hear it, to sense things in our body, etc. So our brain is very complex, with each portion of our brain having really specific functions. One of the more complex behaviors that humans exhibit is our ability to have language and distinct speech. So the first language area within the left hemisphere to be discovered is Broca's area. You can see it right here. This was named after Paul Broca, who discovered the area while studying patients with a language disorder. Broca's area doesn't just handle getting language out in a motor sense, though. It seems to be more generally involved in the ability to process the grammar itself, at least the more complex aspects of grammar. For example, it handles distinguishing a sentence in the passive form from a simpler subject-verb-object sentence. The difference between a sentence like, "the girl was hit by the boy," and a sentence that says, "the boy hit the girl." So we can distinguish between those because of all of the neural conduction that's taking place in Broca's area. The second language area to be discovered is called Wernicke's area, after Karl Wernicke, a German neurologist who discovered the area while studying patients who had similar symptoms to Broca's area's patients, but damage to a different part of their brain. These people had damage to an area of the brain that affected speech comprehension, called receptive aphasia. People with receptive aphasia also have difficulty recalling the names of objects, often responding with words that sound similar or the names of related things, as if they're having a hard time recalling word associations. Language and speech are just one example of information processing that occurs in the cerebral cortex. In addition, our cerebral cortex is going to receive input from our sensory organs and from our somatosensory receptors. So our sense of touch and pain and pressure and temperature, where our hands and feet and body are located, are additional examples of information processing that's going to occur as information is being received. So in the next diagram, I'm going to show you how the different parts of the body are perceived by the brain and sort of the distribution of that sensory input and output that occurs. Here's a diagram called a homunculus, which shows you the cerebral cortex, and then along the side you see what parts of the human body are being controlled by that portion of the brain. This frontal lobe, these are all of the motions and movements that are controlled by different parts. And so you see that there's a lot of the space donated to controlling and moving the muscles of our face, our hands and fingers, not so much on our elbows, but then again on our feet and hands. And so remember, the frontal lobe was responsible for skeletal muscle movement. So when we look at that up close, you can see that some parts of our body have more portions of the brain dedicated to them, which only makes sense. You can't really move your forearm a lot compared to being able to move your fingers. So it's not surprising that you have a smaller portion of your brain that's donated or dedicated to managing that part of your body. Whereas your mouth, you can use that a lot, and so you have a fairly large portion of your brain that is dedicated to managing the skeletal muscles of your mouth as well as your tongue. For the somatosensory cortex, we see that there are parts of our body that are much more sensitive than others. Notice from here, from this little spot, all the way over to here is the senses of sort of your core of your body. But then when you look at the senses of your hand, and particularly the tips of your fingers, look at how much of your brain is dedicated to the senses of the lip and the tongue. You'll see that parts of your body are much more sensitive than others. And so that part of the body, the somatosensory cortex, is responsible for having impulse come in from those areas of the body and detecting the senses of that part of the body. So the frontal lobe, this very front part of the brain, in addition, remember we were just looking at the part of it that was responsible for skeletal movement, but it also, this part of our brain performs a lot of our executive functions like thinking and making decisions. And so for that reason, this portion of our brain is considered to be the seat of our intelligence, because that's where our thought is generated. So in the end, old Phineas survived. You can tell he's got a little facial damage as a result of his accident, but he's posing with that piece of metal that was driven through his head. So why is it that he was able to survive damage to his cerebral hemisphere? When we look, the pipe that went through didn't damage all of his cerebral cortex. It only damaged part of it, so he was still left with a lot of function. Interestingly, though, they did report that his mood was different and his personality was different, and that he tended to was much more rash. So it's not surprising, because he got part of that frontal lobe was damaged as a result of his accident. So even though he lost a portion of his brain, he was still able to survive, and that allowed him to still be able to function. Next time, when we look one more time at the nervous system, we're going to consider how that movement or the motor output piece occurs. So I'll see you then.